History's greatest rulers often had no crown, no throne, and no official title. These were the power brokers, the hidden architects who shaped empires from the shadows. Through wealth, wisdom, or sheer cunning, they pulled the strings of kings and emperors while staying out of the spotlight. In this video, you'll discover how these forgotten figures controlled nations, toppled dynasties, and redirected the flow of history itself. How did a banker's gold decide the fate of Rome? Why would an emperor trust a slave more than his own generals? And what does it truly mean to hold power when no one knows your name? By the end, you'll see ancient history not as a story of thrones and conquests, but as a subtle game of influence played by masters you've never heard of. Who do you think really holds the power in our world today? But to truly understand their game, we must first define the player. A power broker in the ancient world was not a king, not an emperor, not a general with a crown. These were individuals who mastered a different kind of authority, one built on networks rather than titles. Their influence flowed through the veins of an empire like a hidden current, moving armies and treasuries without a single official command. They operated through three primary currencies: loyalty, wealth, and knowledge. A trusted advisor could whisper a single idea into a ruler's ear that would alter foreign policy for generations. A wealthy financier could bankroll an entire war, deciding its outcome not on the battlefield, but from a counting house. A high priest or oracle, holding the keys to divine knowledge, could sanction a conquest or condemn a ruler with a single interpretation of the stars. Consider the court eunuchs of the Byzantine Empire. Barred from the throne by tradition and law, many instead became the ultimate insiders. They controlled access to the emperor, managed the vast imperial bureaucracy, and often held the private purse strings of the state. Their power did not come from a crown, but from their proximity to the man who wore it and their control over the information he received. Or look to the merchant princes of Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon. They never ruled as kings, but their commercial networks stretched across the entire Mediterranean. Their fleets were their armies, their trade goods their weapons, and their economic influence could make or break kingdoms. They shaped empires by controlling the flow of precious resources, from cedar wood to purple dye, making monarchs dependent on their wealth. This is the foundational truth of the power broker. Their authority was decentralized, indirect, and often completely invisible to the common citizen. They understood that a throne could be a cage, but influence was a key that could open any door. The most dangerous power is the kind that needs no bodyguard. For every famous tyrant or celebrated emperor, there was often a mind behind the madness, a strategist operating just out of frame. These were the royal advisors, the official counselors whose true influence extended far beyond their job description. They were the ultimate kingmakers, and in some cases, the unseen kings themselves. Take the philosopher Seneca, tasked with mentoring the young Emperor Nero. On paper, Seneca was just a tutor. In reality, he became the chief architect of the early part of Nero's reign, writing his speeches, crafting his policies, and trying to steer the impulsive young man toward stable rule. Seneca's words became the emperor's words, his thoughts became imperial decrees. For a time, he was the steady hand on the tiller of the Roman Empire, proving that the pen, when held by the right person, is far mightier than the sword. Centuries later in France, Cardinal Richelieu performed a similar feat, but with even more audacious results. Officially, he was the chief minister to King Louis XIII. In practice, Richelieu was the state. He centralized the French monarchy's power, outmaneuvered the nobility, and turned France into a dominant European force. His famous political testament reveals the cold, calculating logic of a man who saw the throne not as a seat of absolute power, but as a tool to be managed. He famously stated that if you give me 6 lines written by the most honest man, I will find something in them to hang him. This was not the sentiment of a mere helper, it was the doctrine of a master. The relationship between an advisor and their ruler was a perilous high-wire act, a constant dance of trust and manipulation. The advisor had to be indispensable but never appear too ambitious. They had to guide the monarch's will while letting the ruler believe every good idea was his own. Their power was built on a foundation of intellect, deep political connections, and an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics. They controlled the flow of information, becoming the gatekeeper between the ruler and the rest of the world. This made them the ultimate insiders. A general could win a battle, but an advisor could decide whether that battle was fought at all. A treasurer could count the gold, but an advisor could determine how it was spent. Their weapon was not the army, but access, and for those who mastered this role, the throne itself became almost irrelevant. Why bear the crown's crushing weight when you could simply whisper into the ear of the person who did? Yet real power does not always whisper from the throne room. It often speaks the silent language of coin. While advisors shaped policy, another class of power broker built empires with pure economic might. These were the financial masters, the bankers and merchants whose wealth became a weapon more potent than any army. They understood a fundamental truth that kings often forgot, that gold could buy loyalty, silence opposition, and even finance a war, making the banker the ultimate arbiter of a ruler's ambitions. In Renaissance Florence, the Medici family perfected this art. Officially, they were bankers. In reality, they were the unseen rulers of the city-state and beyond. Their financial network stretched across Europe, lending vast sums to kings and popes. This debt translated into immense political influence. They could install friendly cardinals, sway papal elections, and effectively decide who held the highest office in Christendom. The Medici did not need a crown. They controlled the treasury that funded everyone else's. This model of economic influence was not new. Centuries earlier in the Roman Republic, Marcus Licinius Crassus was arguably the richest man in Rome. His fortune, built on real estate and shrewd business, made him a pivotal force in the dying days of the Republic. He famously said that no man could call himself rich unless he could afford to raise his own army. Crassus did not just fund political campaigns, he bankrolled the entire faction of Julius Caesar and Pompey, forming the powerful First Triumvirate. His money literally built the alliance that would eventually end the Republic and give birth to the Roman Empire. His wealth made him a kingmaker, proving that control over resources could dictate the fate of nations. This pattern repeated itself across the ancient world. A ruler might command the armies, but without a steady flow of gold to pay the soldiers or grain to feed the population, that command was meaningless. The merchant who controlled the trade routes for Egyptian grain, the mining magnate who owned the Spanish silver mines, the banker who could extend credit for a new fleet of warships, these individuals held the true lifelines of power. They could strangle a war effort by calling in a debt or elevate a new leader by financing their rise. Their authority was not granted by a title, but was earned through economic necessity. So the next time you picture an ancient emperor in all his glory, ask yourself one question: who was really signing the checks? But gold and political cunning were not the only paths to unseen authority. In a world steeped in the supernatural, the voice of the gods was the most powerful currency of all. Religious figures held a unique form of influence. one that could make an emperor kneel or a nation rise in revolt with a single interpretation of divine will. They were the gatekeepers to the heavens, and their pronouncements carried the weight of eternity. The most famous of these was the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece. Kings, generals, and ordinary citizens alike made the arduous pilgrimage to this remote sanctuary, seeking guidance from the priestess who channeled the god Apollo. Her cryptic prophecies, often open to interpretation, decided the fates of wars and the founding of colonies. A positive word from the oracle could legitimize a shaky new ruler, while a warning of doom could shatter a tyrant's hold on power. Her influence was so profound that city-states would go to war over the control of her sanctuary, knowing that whoever held Delphi held the ear of the gods. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was himself a god, but he relied entirely on the priestly class to maintain that divine image. The high priests of Ammon at Thebes controlled vast temple estates, immense wealth, and the intricate religious rituals that sustained the pharaoh's claim to divinity. Without their blessing, a pharaoh's rule could be seen as illegitimate, a mere mortal pretending to a throne that required a god. The priests did not just advise, they validated the very essence of royal power. This relationship was a delicate dance. A pharaoh needed the priests, but a savvy high priest knew that his own power was dependent on a strong, yet compliant ruler. Their influence was a quiet, constant undercurrent in Egyptian politics, sometimes bubbling to the surface when a priestly faction decided to back a new claimant to the throne. Far to the north in Celtic Europe, the Druids held a similar role. They were not just priests, but also judges, historians, and political advisors. A Celtic chieftain could not declare war or broker a peace treaty without consulting the Druidic order. Their authority transcended tribal borders, making them the ultimate neutral party and the keepers of a shared cultural identity. They could halt a battle simply by stepping between two armies, their presence considered so sacred that no warrior would dare strike. This was power that needed no army, only the unshakable faith of the people. In each of these cases, spiritual and temporal power were locked in a symbiotic embrace. Ruler and priest each needed the other to survive. The king provided protection and earthly authority, while the religious leader provided something far more valuable: the unquestioning belief of the populace. This made faith the ultimate tool for control, an invisible chain that could bind a society together or be pulled taut to bring a would-be tyrant to his knees. Yet the throne room was not the only chamber where power was brokered. Often, the most decisive maneuvers happened in the quiet of the royal apartments, orchestrated by the women who stood closest to the crown. In a world that officially denied them authority, queens, mothers, and consorts became masters of the indirect approach, wielding influence through diplomacy, family ties, and a deep understanding of the court's hidden machinery. Their power was a whisper that could topple empires. Agrippina the Younger stands as a stunning example of this behind-the-scenes control. As the mother of Nero, she was determined to see her son rule Rome. She orchestrated a breathtaking series of political maneuvers, marrying the Emperor Claudius to become Empress, then persuading him to adopt Nero as his heir over his own son. Once Nero was on the throne, she attempted to rule through him, even having her own image placed on the coinage alongside his. For a time, she was the true power in Rome, a mother who built an empire for her son and tried to keep him on a leash. On the other side of the world, in 19th century China, Empress Dowager Cixi executed a similar feat on an even grander scale. Starting as a low-ranking concubine, she used her intelligence and ruthlessness to become the mother of an heir. When her son became emperor, she ruled as regent, and even after he came of age, she remained the dominant force in the Qing dynasty for nearly 5 decades. She navigated a deeply patriarchal system by mastering court intrigue, forming powerful alliances with officials, and eliminating her rivals. She understood that while a man might sit on the dragon throne, true authority flowed through the networks of loyalty and information that she so carefully cultivated. These women and countless others like them operated in a narrow space between tradition and ambition. They could not always command armies outright, but they could persuade the commander. They could not always pass laws, but they could advise the lawmaker. They used their roles as mothers, wives, and confidantes to shape policy, advocate for allies, and steer the course of history from the shadows. Their influence was a testament to the fact that power is not always about who gives the orders. Sometimes it is about who has the ear of the person who does. It is a reminder that the softest voice in the room can sometimes tell the hardest truth or plant the most dangerous idea. But to truly control an empire, one must first control the gate. In the hushed corridors of power, no one understood this better than the court eunuch. Barred by tradition from founding their own dynasties, these men were often seen as the ultimate loyal servants, devoid of the ambition that plagued noble families. This perceived safety made them indispensable to rulers, granting them an intimacy and access that no general or minister could ever hope to achieve. Their power was born from a simple, brutal fact: they were always there. In the sprawling bureaucracy of the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs were not merely attendants, they were administrators, diplomats, and even military commanders. Take the general Narses, a eunuch who served Emperor Justinian. He was tasked with finishing the job his predecessor Belisarius could not, crushing the Ostrogoths in Italy. With no sons to crown and no bloodline to elevate, Narcissus' loyalty was considered unquestionable. His brilliant tactics led to a decisive victory, and he went on to rule Italy as the Byzantine governor for over a decade. His story shatters the stereotype of the meek chamberlain, revealing a figure who wielded both the pen and the sword with formidable skill. Yet for every Narses leading armies abroad, there were dozens more operating within the palace walls. Their official title might be keeper of the chamber or superintendent of the sacred bedchamber, but their real function was far greater. They controlled the flow of people, petitions, and information to the emperor. A dissatisfied noble could be denied an audience for weeks. A crucial piece of military intelligence could be delayed just long enough to be useless. A rival's name could be casually omitted from a list of promotions. This gatekeeping role made them the ultimate filters of reality for the ruler. Nowhere was this system more refined than in the courts of Imperial China, particularly during the Han Dynasty. Eunuchs were deeply embedded in the imperial household, serving the emperor and his many consorts. Their proximity was their weapon. They were the eyes and ears of the palace, privy to every secret and every insecurity. As the Han emperors grew increasingly isolated, preferring the comforts of the inner court to the demands of public ceremony, the eunuchs became their primary connection to the outside world. They interpreted reports, delivered messages, and offered counsel. This influence inevitably bled into state policy. Factions of eunuchs and scholarly officials, known as mandarins, engaged in a constant, vicious struggle for the emperor's ear. The eunuchs often held the advantage, whispering their advice during private moments, swaying decisions on taxation, appointments, and even declarations of war. Their most profound power, however, lay in the manipulation of succession. A eunuch attendant could influence which prince spent the most time with the emperor, which son received the most favor, and ultimately which one was named heir. They could forge an alliance with a future ruler, ensuring their own survival and influence long after the current emperor was gone. This was the ultimate long game, playing for a throne they could never sit upon but could forever stand beside. A sword can carve an empire, but the hand that wields it does not always seek a crown. For some of history's most brilliant military leaders, ultimate victory was not measured by a coronation, but by the sheer scale of their influence over the fate of nations. They operated in a precarious space, balancing loyal service with the intoxicating pull of personal power, their authority forged in the crucible of war rather than bestowed by birthright. Consider Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general. For over a decade, he was the single greatest threat to the rising power of Rome, leading his army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps to strike at the heart of the Republic. His name alone struck terror into the Roman populace, yet Hannibal never sought to become king of Carthage. His power was entirely based on his military genius and the loyalty of his soldiers. He was a force of nature, a strategic mastermind whose decisions on distant battlefields dictated the foreign policy of both Rome and Carthage for a generation. He was the ultimate example of a general who held de facto control without any formal political title, his influence so vast it reshaped the Mediterranean world. Then there is the curious case of Belisarius, the foremost general of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Belisarius was the instrument through which Justinian dreamed of reconquering the lost Western Roman Empire. He won stunning victories in North Africa and Italy, commanding armies with unparalleled skill. His troops adored him, and his successes brought him immense glory and wealth. But Belisarius, famously loyal, always returned his power to the emperor. He navigated the constant suspicion that comes with a general's fame, repeatedly proving his allegiance even when Justinian recalled him out of envy or fear. His authority was immense, but he chose to channel it entirely through the throne, becoming the perfect servant whose loyalty was his greatest source of strength. This delicate dance between service and ambition was the defining tension for every great military power broker. They had to be strong enough to win wars, but not so powerful that they appeared as a threat to the sovereign they served. They controlled the army, the most potent instrument of state power, and with it they could defend an empire or dismantle one. This is why rulers watched their most successful generals with a mixture of reliance and dread. A general's tent could become a second court, his officers a rival nobility based on merit and shared danger rather than ancient bloodlines, and for some, the lure of that power proved too great to resist. The most famous example is, of course, Julius Caesar. He began as a brilliant general and political operator within the framework of the Roman Republic. His conquest of Gaul brought him unprecedented military prestige, staggering wealth to distribute among his troops, and the fanatical loyalty of a battle-hardened legion. For years, he was the ultimate power broker, using his military command as a base to influence politics in Rome from afar. But the Rubicon River marked the point of no return. By crossing it with his army, he broke the ancient law that forbade a general from entering Italy under arms. In that moment, he crossed the final line from being a broker who influenced the state to becoming the state itself. His story is the ultimate warning of what happened when the sword decided it no longer needed to answer to the crown. Ideas are the most durable form of power, outliving every dynasty and outlasting every army. While kings conquered lands, it was often the philosophers who conquered minds, providing the intellectual blueprint for how an empire should be run. These thinkers, frequently operating far from the palace, became the unseen architects of statecraft, their ideas rippling through centuries of policy and law. In ancient China, Confucius never held high office, yet his philosophy became the very foundation of Chinese governance for 2 millennia. He taught that a ruler's legitimacy came not from divine right, but from moral virtue and benevolent treatment of his subjects. His emphasis on social harmony, filial piety, and a merit-based bureaucracy provided a complete operating system for the state. Emperors who followed his teachings were seen as just, while those who ignored them risked losing the mandate of heaven, the very concept that justified their rule. A philosopher who died an apparent failure had, in fact, written the code for one of history's most enduring empires. Across the world, in ancient Greece, Aristotle performed a similar service for a very different kind of ruler. As the tutor to a young Alexander the Great, he had the ear of the most ambitious conqueror the world had ever known. While we remember Alexander for his military genius, it was Aristotle who provided the intellectual framework. He schooled Alexander in ethics, science, and politics, shaping the mind that would seek to blend Greek and Persian cultures into a new, unified world order. The cities Alexander founded became centers of Greek learning and philosophy, spreading Aristotelian ideas far beyond the Aegean. The teacher, not the king, became the true author of this cultural revolution. Even in the practical, militaristic Roman Empire, philosophy held immense sway among the powerful. Stoic thinkers like Seneca, whom we have already met, advised Emperor Nero on the principles of duty, self-control, and rational leadership. Later, Emperor Marcus Aurelius would literally write the book on Stoic leadership, his meditations serving as a private diary of philosophical struggle. In it, he constantly reminds himself of his duty to reason and to his people, using philosophy as a guide for the immense burden of power. These were not abstract academic exercises, they were practical tools for ruling a vast and complex empire. The philosophers' power was subtle but profound. They could not issue a command, but they could define what justice meant. They could not levy a tax, but they could argue for its ethical purpose. They provided the language of legitimacy, the moral compass for the state, and the educational foundation for its future leaders. A king might rule for a lifetime, but a philosopher's idea could rule for 1,000 years. So we must ask who truly held the authority, the emperor who enforced the law or the thinker who first defined it. While philosophers shaped the mind of the state, another kind of operator shaped its relationships. The diplomat moved through a world of shadows and subtlety, where a single conversation could prevent a war or redraw a map. These emissaries carried no crown's authority, only their wits and their mastery of words, yet the treaties they negotiated often held more power than any royal decree. They were the ultimate power brokers in the space between nations, masters of a delicate art where a whispered suggestion could carry the weight of an army. Consider the ancient Athenian Themistocles. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, he was sent to negotiate with potential allies in Sparta. His mission was one of pure delay, to keep the Spartans talking while Athens hurriedly rebuilt its defensive walls. Through brilliant oratory and clever misdirection, he spun out the discussions, giving his city the precious time it needed to secure its future. Themistocles did not command soldiers in that moment, but his strategic deception provided a security more lasting than any battle victory. His story reveals a profound truth, that the pen of a diplomat could be as vital to a nation's survival as the sword of its general. This art reached its zenith in the intricate courts of medieval Europe. Here, marriage was not about romance but raw geopolitical strategy. Diplomats were dispatched to broker unions between royal houses, weaving a web of alliances that stretched across the continent. A successful match could unite two powerful kingdoms, ending generations of bloodshed and creating a new superpower overnight. The diplomat who arranged such a marriage held the future of nations in his hands, yet his name was rarely remembered in the royal lineages he helped to create. These emissaries operated in a permanent gray area. They represented their sovereign's interests, but they were often weeks or months of travel away from any new instructions. This forced them to act with immense independent judgment, interpreting their master's will while navigating foreign customs and hidden agendas. Their most vital tools were not weapons, but deep cultural understanding, fluency in languages, and an intuitive grasp of human psychology. They had to know what a rival king truly desired, what a minister secretly feared, and what concession would be seen as a gesture of goodwill rather than a sign of weakness. A misstep could mean insult, imprisonment, or even spark the very conflict they were sent to prevent. Their power was entirely relational, built on trust and perception. A respected emissary could open doors that were closed to armies. Their carefully chosen words could turn an enemy into an ally, making them the true architects of peace and the unseen engineers of war. They proved that the most complex battles are not always fought with armies, but across the negotiating table, with the fate of millions resting on a single, perfectly phrased argument. But the most dangerous secrets were not whispered in court, they were stolen from the shadows. Beyond the philosopher's study and the diplomat's chamber lay a world of pure information, a web of spies and informants who traded not in gold or ideas, but in the raw currency of secrets. These intelligence networks were the hidden eyes and ears of the state, and the men who controlled them held a power so subtle that even the rulers they served were often unaware of its full extent. In the vast Persian Empire, the king's eyes and ears were not just a colorful title, they were a formal institution. These royal agents were dispatched to every satrapy, every province, reporting directly back to the king on the loyalty of local governors, the morale of the army, and the murmurs of the populace. Their authority was absolute, and their presence was a constant reminder that the king's reach was long, and his attention was everywhere. A governor planning treason might find his plans known in the capital before he had even finished his dinner. This system was less about punishing crime and more about preventing it, using the fear of exposure as the ultimate tool of control. The Romans, ever practical, developed their own sophisticated espionage service, but with a characteristically clever twist. They used the Frumentarii, soldiers originally tasked with securing the army's grain supply, the frumentum. Their duty to travel across the empire made them the perfect cover for clandestine work. Who would suspect a simple grain collector of being an imperial spy? These men evolved into the emperor's personal couriers and secret police, gathering intelligence on political rivals, monitoring suspicious senators, and quietly eliminating threats. Their power was terrifying because it was so invisible. A senator might vanish overnight, his fate unknown. A silent victim of a report filed by a man he assumed was just a lowly logistics officer. The true influence of these spies lay in their control of information itself. They decided what truth reached the ruler's ears. A general known for his arrogance could be portrayed as a budding traitor through carefully selected reports. A loyal administrator could be undermined by omitting his achievements and highlighting minor failures. This gatekeeping role meant the spy master, the man who collated the reports, held a terrifying form of power. He could shape the emperor's perception of reality, triggering military campaigns, political purges, or economic policies based on the secrets he chose to share or to withhold. These operatives understood that in the game of power, information was the ultimate weapon. A sword could win a battle, but a single secret, delivered at the right moment to the right person, could win an empire without a single drop of blood being spilled. A royal decree was only as powerful as the man entrusted to enforce it. While the emperor drafted laws in the capital, their true meaning was decided 1,000 miles away by the local governor holding the parchment. These regional administrators were the crucial link between the lofty ideals of the center and the gritty reality of the provinces, and many used this position to build empires of their own. The Persian Empire mastered this system with the satrapy. Each satrap was a governor appointed to rule a vast province, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and raising local militias. In theory, they answered directly to the King of Kings. In practice, the immense distances and slow communication meant a satrap often operated with near total independence. A clever or ambitious satrap could quietly skim treasure from the tax revenues, cultivate a fiercely loyal personal army, and negotiate with neighboring powers as if he were a sovereign himself. The central court relied on his reports, meaning the truth of what happened in a distant province was often whatever the satrap decided to write. He could make a region flourish or deliberately run it into the ground to weaken the throne's influence. The Roman Empire faced the same relentless challenge. A provincial governor like Julius Caesar in Gaul was not just an administrator, he was a proconsul, a military commander, and a judge rolled into one. He had the power of life and death over the local population and the soldiers under his command. While the Senate in Rome debated, Caesar was on the ground, winning the loyalty of his legions through victory and plunder, making alliances with local chieftains, and building a personal fortune so vast it could bankroll a civil war. His governorship was not a bureaucratic post, it was a power base that allowed him to ultimately challenge the republic itself. This was the eternal dilemma for any large empire. To control distant lands, you had to grant power to local rulers, but in granting that power, you risked creating a rival. A successful governor commanded the two things any throne needed most: money and men. He controlled the flow of taxes back to the capital and the loyalty of the troops who collected them. If he decided to delay the treasury's shipment or redirect it to his own coffers, the central government might not know for months. If he whispered promises of reward to his officers, he could turn an imperial legion into his personal guard. Their authority was a balancing act, a constant test of loyalty against ambition. For every faithful servant who strengthened the empire, there was another who saw his post not as a duty, but as an opportunity. A king's army could seize a city, but a merchant's embargo could starve it into surrender. While individual financiers built private fortunes, the most formidable economic power was often collective, wielded by vast networks of merchants who answered not to a single crown, but to the unchanging law of profit and loss. These guilds and trade leagues became shadow empires, their influence woven through the commercial arteries of continents, capable of bending kings to their will with the quiet threat of economic collapse. They proved that the most effective siege weapon was not a catapult, but a closed market. In the cold waters of the Baltic and North Seas, the Hanseatic League emerged as a perfect example of this power. It began as a simple association of German trading towns, a mutual protection society for merchant ships, but it grew into a sprawling economic superpower that at its peak included nearly 200 cities. The Hansa did not have a king, an army, or a defined territory. What it had was something far more valuable, a monopoly. It controlled the flow of salt, fish, timber, fur, and grain across northern Europe. This control gave it immense leverage. If a king like Edward IV of England threatened the League's privileges, the Hanseatic merchants could simply shut down trade. They could embargo his ports, refuse to import English wool, and financially support his political rivals. Faced with the prospect of a bankrupt treasury and a restless nobility, monarchs almost always capitulated, granting the League tax exemptions, legal immunity, and their own autonomous trading posts called contours in major ports. These merchant enclaves were essentially independent city-states within a kingdom, operating under Hanseatic law and paying Hanseatic taxes. The League's leaders were not nobles, they were pragmatists who understood that wealth was a tool for negotiation. They funded wars for friendly rulers and withdrew support from hostile ones, making them kingmakers in all but name. On the other side of the world, the Silk Road operated on a similar principle, though it was a route, not a formal league. The merchant caravans that traversed the deserts and mountains between China and the Mediterranean were the lifelines of empires. They carried more than just silk and spices. They carried ideas, technologies, and news. A savvy Silk Road merchant amassed not only gold but also intelligence, knowing the political situation in a dozen different courts. This made him an invaluable, if unofficial, diplomat. He could carry messages between warring powers, suggest alliances, or warn of impending invasions, all under the neutral guise of commerce. These merchants lobbied tirelessly for the things that made them rich: safe passage, standardized currencies, and protection from bandits. Their collective wealth meant they could often pay for these protections themselves, hiring private security that was more effective than a king's distant army. By financing the caravanserais, the rest stops that dotted the trade routes, they built the infrastructure of globalization itself. Whether in the guild halls of London or the markets of Samarkand, these collective bodies understood a fundamental truth. A single merchant could be ignored, taxed into oblivion, or robbed, but a united guild of merchants represented an entire economy. They could move markets, sway public opinion through the price of bread, and offer or withhold the loans that kept a government solvent. Their power was quiet, patient, and relentless. They did not need to conquer a throne when they could simply rent it, one favorable trade deal at a time. The most trusted man in the emperor's inner circle was often the one who had once been his property. In the rigid hierarchies of the ancient world, slaves and freedmen were legally powerless, yet some ascended to dizzying heights of influence, becoming the indispensable administrators of empires. Their authority was a paradox built on a foundation of absolute dependence. Because they owed everything to the ruler, they were seen as extensions of his will, loyal instruments with no competing family allegiances or political ambitions of their own. This perceived safety granted them access that made even the most powerful nobles jealous. In Rome, the rise of the imperial freedmen is a stunning story of bureaucratic power. When the Emperor Claudius took power, he distrusted the traditional senatorial class, the very nobles who snickered at his physical ailments and doubted his abilities. Instead, he turned to his own household staff, his freedmen. These were former slaves he had personally granted freedom and citizenship, men who owed their entire existence and status to his favor. Chief among them was a man named Narcissus. Narcissus held the title of Secretary of Correspondence, a seemingly mundane administrative post. In reality, he became the emperor's chief of staff, gatekeeper, and political fixer. He controlled the flow of all imperial communications, advised Claudius on matters of high policy, and managed a staggering treasury of 100 million sesterces. His influence was so vast that during the planning of the invasion of Britain, it was Narcissus who was chosen to address the troops and quell a mutiny, a role traditionally reserved for the emperor or a senior general. The sight of a former slave commanding Rome's legions was a shocking testament to where real power now resided. This model repeated itself for centuries in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Grand Chamberlain, almost always a eunuch, was frequently a former slave who commanded the imperial palace's inner sanctum. He controlled the sacred bedchamber, managed the emperor's private schedule, and held the ultimate power of access. A bribable official might let a petition slip to the bottom of a pile, but the chamberlain decided if you ever got to see the emperor's face at all. His whispered opinion over a morning meal could carry more weight than a general's report delivered in the full Senate. The Ottoman Empire perfected this system into an art form with the Devshirme. This was the practice of collecting young boys from Christian communities in the Balkans, converting them to Islam and training them for imperial service. The most promising were recruited into the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that became the Sultan's most fearsome soldiers. Others entered the palace school, where they received a rigorous education in administration, finance, and military strategy. The brightest of these could rise to become pashas, admirals of the fleet, or even the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister and the second most powerful man in the empire. These men were legally the Sultan's slaves, yet they commanded armies, governed provinces, and wielded fortunes. Their power was absolute, but it was also conditional, existing only for as long as they retained the Sultan's favor. This system worked because it created a ruling class with no loyalty except to the throne. They had no noble families to please, no ancestral lands to protect. Their entire identity and status were forged in service to the state. This made them ruthlessly efficient administrators and fiercely loyal operatives, but it also made them vulnerable. A single misstep, a whispered rumor of disloyalty, could see a man who controlled millions toppled from power in an instant, his wealth confiscated and his life forfeit. Their stories force us to ask a difficult question. Is true power the authority you seize for yourself, or the trust placed in you by the most powerful person in the room? A poet's verse could legitimize a ruler more effectively than any army. While spies traded in secrets and merchants moved markets, artists and writers dealt in a far more potent currency, perception. They crafted the stories that defined an era, transforming ambitious politicians into destined heroes and bloody conquests into glorious destinies. Their work was the velvet glove around the iron fist of power, and the most skilled among them became indispensable architects of a regime's public image. The Roman poet Virgil stands as the ultimate example of this subtle art. Commissioned by the Emperor Augustus, he spent over a decade composing the Aeneid, a national epic that wove the emperor's reign directly into the mythological fabric of Rome itself. The poem tells the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero destined by the gods to found the Roman people. By the end of the epic, a prophecy reveals that Augustus is the fulfillment of this divine plan, the promised leader who would usher in a long-awaited golden age of peace and prosperity. Virgil was not merely writing poetry. He was building a cultural foundation for the entire principate, turning recent civil wars into a necessary prelude to a glorious future. His words gave Augustus a legitimacy that stretched back to the gods themselves, a narrative far more powerful than any decree from the Senate. This was not crude propaganda. It was a masterpiece of political storytelling that resonated deeply with the Roman soul. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, a similar dynamic played out on canvas instead of parchment. Artists like Titian, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael were not just hired for their technical skill, but for their ability to manufacture magnificence. A portrait was never just a likeness, it was a carefully constructed argument for the subject's power, virtue, and right to rule. A duke might be painted in the armor of a Roman emperor, surrounded by symbols of justice and learning, his flaws airbrushed away by the artist's genius. These images were distributed to other courts, shaping how rivals and allies perceived the ruler. The artist's studio became a factory for legitimacy, and the most sought-after painters lived like princes because their brushstrokes could make a man look like one. But this relationship was a double-edged sword. A playwright could just as easily mock a king as praise him. In Elizabethan England, the theatre was a powerful arena for public commentary. William Shakespeare's plays are filled with nuanced explorations of power, legitimacy, and the burdens of leadership. While he often celebrated the Tudor dynasty, his histories also contained subtle warnings about the dangers of tyranny and the fickleness of the mob. The crown recognized this power, which is why the theater was both patronized and carefully watched. A well-placed line of dialogue could become a viral sensation, shaping London's opinion overnight. The cultural influencer, therefore, always walked a fine line. Their patronage depended on the powerful, but their credibility depended on their art's connection to a deeper truth. They had to glorify without appearing obsequious, to advise without appearing to lecture. Their true power lay in this negotiation, their ability to give the ruler not just what he wanted, but what he needed to be seen as a narrative so compelling it would be remembered long after the throne itself had turned to dust. A physician's access was the most intimate of all. While generals reported on battles and advisors on politics, the royal doctor alone entered the private chambers, witnessing the ruler at their most vulnerable. This proximity, built on trust and necessity, became a unique conduit for power, allowing healers to influence decisions that reached far beyond the sick room. Their authority was born in moments of fever and fear, where a medical opinion could sound like a prophecy and a treatment plan could reshape imperial policy. In Imperial Rome, the Greek physician Galen perfected this role. Appointed to the court of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, his duties extended far beyond diagnosing illness. He became the ultimate authority on the imperial diet, daily routine, and overall regimen, effectively controlling the physical well-being of the most powerful man in the world. His recommendations on what the emperor should eat, when he should sleep, and how he should manage stress carried the weight of scientific decree. This gave Galen a soft but persistent influence. He could argue that a certain advisor caused the emperor too much anxiety and should be kept at a distance, or that a particular province's climate was unhealthy for the imperial constitution, subtly guiding travel plans and political focus. His medical authority became a backdoor to political counsel, all under the unimpeachable guise of preserving the emperor's health. This model was echoed in ancient India, where the court physician, or Rajvaidya, was a polymath. His knowledge encompassed not just medicine or Ayurveda, but also astrology, statecraft, and philosophy. He was a trusted confidant whose advice was sought on the most auspicious time for a coronation, the strategic placement of a new capital, or the negotiation of a treaty. His diagnosis could determine a prince's fitness to rule, and his reading of the stars could delay a military campaign. The line between physical health and the health of the state was deliberately blurred, making the physician's role indispensable to the machinery of governance. This unique position allowed healers to play the most delicate of games, especially regarding succession. A doctor attending a dying king held immense, fleeting power. His prognosis could accelerate a transfer of power or plunge a court into a waiting game. A whispered opinion on which son was strongest, or which queen was most fit to serve as regent, could tilt the balance for a favored faction. Their influence was never recorded in official decrees, but it was felt in the quiet moments of crisis, when the fate of an empire hung on a pulse and the trusted words of the one person who understood it. Sometimes the greatest challenge to power came not from the palace but from the soil. While advisors, financiers, and spies maneuvered within the system, a different kind of figure operated entirely outside it, seeking not to control the throne but to shatter its foundations. These were the rebel leaders and revolutionaries, men and women who rose from the very bottom of society to threaten the established order, proving that even the mightiest empire could be shaken by the collective will of the oppressed. Their power was not drawn from wealth or title, but from a simple, undeniable truth, a shared grievance that could unite thousands into a single, formidable force. The most iconic of these figures is Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator who escaped a slave school in Capua and sparked a rebellion that would terrorize Rome for 2 years. He was not a disgruntled noble or a rival general. He was human property, the lowest form of life in the Roman world. Yet he masterfully welded an army of fellow slaves, shepherds, and laborers into a disciplined fighting force that humiliated legion after legion sent to crush them. Spartacus never sought to claim the title of emperor or king. His goal was far more radical: to break the entire system of Roman slavery and lead his people to freedom. Though his rebellion was ultimately defeated, its impact was seismic. The Roman elite were left deeply paranoid, terrified that the very infrastructure of their society, built on the backs of millions of enslaved people, could suddenly turn against them. They passed harsh new laws and increased security, but the fear remained, a permanent crack in the foundation of their power. This pattern of uprising from below was not unique to Rome. In medieval Europe, peasant revolts erupted with shocking frequency, often led by charismatic figures who gave voice to the simmering frustrations of the common people. In 14th century England, a radical preacher named John Ball became a spiritual leader for the peasants' revolt, asking a famous rhetorical question that echoed across the countryside. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? His point was a revolutionary one: that the rigid feudal hierarchy was not divinely ordained, but a man-made construct that could be challenged. Though Ball and the revolt's leader, Wat Tyler, were killed, their rebellion forced the young king Richard II to momentarily negotiate and make promises of reform. The rebellion was crushed, but the message was sent: the nobility could not take the obedience of the peasantry for granted. These movements, though almost always brutally suppressed, possessed a different kind of power. They exposed the fragile bargain at the heart of all authority, that rulers ultimately depend on the consent, however coerced, of the governed. A rebel leader could reveal the limits of formal power, demonstrating that an army is useless if the fields are empty and the workshops are silent. They forced emperors and kings to negotiate, to offer concessions, and sometimes to enact real reforms, if only to prevent the next explosion. Their legacy was not a dynasty, but a precedent, a story passed down through generations that whispered a dangerous idea: that those with nothing to lose could sometimes topple the mightiest of thrones. The most enduring ideas were not born in palace corridors, but in quiet groves of olive trees. Long before the term think tank existed, ancient philosophical schools operated as the research and development departments for entire civilizations. These were not just places for abstract debate, they were rigorous training grounds for the future power brokers who would one day stand beside kings. The academy founded by Plato in Athens was perhaps the most influential of these institutions. Its primary goal was not merely to ponder the nature of reality, but to answer a deeply practical question: what is the ideal state and how do we create it? Plato's masterpiece, The Republic, was essentially a policy paper, a blueprint for a society ruled not by hereditary kings, but by philosopher kings, individuals trained from youth in reason and ethics. While no empire ever adopted his model wholesale, its ideas permeated the ancient world, providing a critical framework for questioning authority and defining justice. His student, Aristotle, took a more empirical approach at his own school, the Lyceum. Here, he and his followers studied the constitutions of over 150 Greek city-states, comparing their laws, their economies, and their systems of governance. This was political science in its purest form, an attempt to derive the best practices of rule from cold, hard data. The result was works like Politics, which argued for balanced constitutions and the rule of law. These ideas became the intellectual toolkit for generations of advisors. A Roman statesman like Cicero was deeply steeped in Greek philosophy, using its principles to argue for a restoration of republican values. Even later, emperors like Marcus Aurelius would lean heavily on Stoic teachings, which emphasized duty and rational leadership, concepts honed in these academic settings. The influence of these schools was a slow, steady drip that eventually carved canyons into the bedrock of power. They provided the language and the logic that advisors used to counsel their rulers. They offered ethical frameworks that could legitimize a reign or condemn a tyrant. A graduate of the academy would not just offer a king a tactical suggestion. He would provide an entire philosophical justification for a policy, wrapping raw power in the respectable cloak of reason. These institutions proved that the most dangerous weapon in politics was not a new siege engine, but a new idea, and the most powerful people were often those who had spent their youth learning how to plant them. A king might command armies, but he could not command the gods. This gap between earthly power and divine will create an opening for a unique kind of broker, the prophet or seer. These individuals claimed a direct line to the supernatural, offering guidance, warnings, and sometimes terrifying ultimatums that could freeze a conqueror in his tracks or send a nation to war. Their authority came not from gold or legions, but from the unshakable belief that they spoke for a power far greater than any throne. In ancient Rome, no prophetic voice was more revered than that of the Sibyl. This was not a single woman, but a title for a succession of priestesses who served at the Oracle of Delphi. Their prophecies, recorded in a collection of cryptic verses known as the Sibylline books, were Rome's most sacred state secret. In moments of crisis, a pestilence, a military defeat, a strange omen, the Roman Senate would consult these books. The priestesses would interpret the verses, prescribing a specific course of action, often the introduction of a new god to the Roman pantheon or the construction of a new temple. A Sibyl's word could literally reshape Roman religion and foreign policy, all based on the perceived need to appease the divine. Her influence was a quiet, constant undercurrent in the politics of the Republic, a reminder that even the most practical of empires bowed to a higher power. A very different dynamic played out in the kingdoms of ancient Israel. Here, prophets like Nathan, Elijah, and Isaiah were not secluded oracles, but public figures who often stood in direct opposition to the king. Their role was not to foretell a distant future, but to hold the ruler accountable to a divine moral law. The famous story of Nathan confronting King David after his affair with Bathsheba is a masterclass in this form of influence. Nathan does not accuse the king directly. Instead, he tells him a parable about a rich man who steals a poor man's only lamb. When David erupts in anger at the injustice of the story, Nathan delivers the devastating line, "You are that man." In that moment, the prophet, a man with no army and no political office, forces the most powerful king in Israel's history to his knees in repentance. This was the power of moral suasion backed by divine authority. It was a check on absolute power, a voice that could declare a king's actions illegitimate in the eyes of God and the people. Yet this perceived connection to the divine was a double-edged sword, a tool that could be used for inspiration or for blatant manipulation. The line between a true believer and a cunning charlatan was often dangerously thin. A seer traveling with an army could interpret the flight of birds or the entrails of a sacrifice to declare whether the omens were favorable for battle. His reading could bolster the troops' courage or shatter it, effectively deciding the outcome before the first spear was thrown. It was a position ripe for abuse. A clever operator could easily tell a general exactly what he wanted to hear, ensuring a generous reward for a favorable prophecy. These figures understood the psychology of power intimately. They knew that a ruler, for all his strength, was often deeply insecure, fearful of invisible forces and hungry for validation. A prophecy could provide that validation, wrapping a political ambition in the cloak of divine destiny, or it could serve as a warning, a brake on a king's worst impulses. Whether saint or fraud, the prophet held a unique key to the human heart, the power to inspire both absolute terror and transcendent hope, and the smartest rulers knew that was a force far too powerful to ignore. Even the sharpest sword could not cut through a legal text. While prophets spoke for the gods and rebels challenged the system, another group wielded a quieter, more enduring form of authority, the power to interpret the law itself. Legal scholars and jurists were the architects of societal order, and their learned opinions could bind the hands of a king, redefine justice, and shape the lives of millions for centuries. Theirs was the power of the footnote, a force more durable than any decree. In ancient Rome, this authority was formalized to an astonishing degree. The most respected jurists, men like Gaius and Ulpian, were private citizens, not government officials. They spent their lives studying the intricate body of Roman law, writing detailed commentaries, and offering legal opinions known as responsa to judges and magistrates. Over time, the emperor himself granted these leading jurists the right to issue opinions that carried the full force of law, the ius respondendi. This meant a scholarly interpretation written in a quiet library could become binding precedent across the entire empire, dictating the outcome of court cases, the validity of contracts, and the limits of governmental power. The jurists did not command legions, but they commanded the very framework within which those legions operated. Their work created a system so robust and logically coherent that it outlasted Rome itself, forming the bedrock of most modern Western legal systems. A similar process unfolded across the Islamic world, where scholars of Sharia law held immense influence over caliphs and sultans. Sharia is not a single, static legal code, but a vast and evolving body of principles derived from the Quran, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and centuries of scholarly consensus. The ulama, the community of legal scholars, were the gatekeepers of this knowledge. A sultan might have the power to conquer a city, but he needed a mufti, a scholar qualified to issue legal rulings called fatwas, to legitimize his rule according to divine law. These scholars operated independent of the state, funded by religious endowments, which gave them a remarkable degree of autonomy. They could declare a ruler's taxes unlawful, his wars unjust, or his policies un-Islamic. This intellectual and spiritual authority acted as a crucial check on raw political power, ensuring that even the most absolute monarch was, in theory, subject to a higher legal and ethical standard. The mastery of these legal experts was not merely academic, it was profoundly practical. They defined the rights of citizens and the obligations of the state. They determined what constituted valid evidence in a court of law, how property could be inherited, and what the limits were on royal taxation. By controlling the interpretation of sacred texts and ancient precedents, they effectively drew the boundaries of power itself. A king could desire to raise an army, but only if the legal scholars agreed the treasury had the right to collect the necessary funds. A ruler might wish to punish an enemy, but only within the strict procedures defined by the jurists to ensure a fair trial. This created a delicate and often tense balance. Ambitious rulers frequently tried to co-opt or pressure the scholarly class, while the most principled jurists resisted, using their command of the law as a shield against tyranny. Their influence proves that the most formidable power is not always the power to command, but the authority to define the rules that everyone, even the commander, must obey. A blueprint could be more powerful than a battle plan. While philosophers shaped minds and spies gathered secrets, another group of power brokers built their influence from the ground up, literally. These were the master builders and engineers whose genius for solving practical problems made them indispensable to any ruler who wished to project strength and ensure the stability of their realm. Their authority was not drawn from noble blood or military might, but from an undeniable, tangible mastery over the physical world. They gave emperors their greatest symbols and cities their very lifelines. In ancient Egypt, the vizier Imhotep achieved something almost unthinkable. He was the chief architect for Pharaoh Djoser, and he designed the very first pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. This was not merely a tomb, it was a revolutionary statement in stone, a structure so awe-inspiring that it transformed the landscape of eternity itself. Imhotep's architectural genius was so profound that it catapulted him far beyond the status of a mere official. Centuries after his death, he was venerated as a god of medicine and wisdom, a common man elevated to the pantheon through the power of his intellect and vision. His legacy demonstrates that the ability to create something eternal could grant a form of immortality that rivaled that of the kings he served. The Romans understood this principle on an empire-wide scale. Their engineers were the unsung heroes of imperial control, and their work was the glue that held the vast territory together. A Roman legion could conquer a region, but it was the engineers who truly pacified and integrated it. They built the arrow-straight roads that allowed legions to march swiftly to crush rebellions. They designed the aqueducts that brought fresh water to burgeoning cities, ensuring the health and loyalty of the populace. And they constructed the formidable walls and fortifications that defined the limits of the civilized world. Each of these projects was a monument to Roman power, but they were also vital, functional tools of governance. A local chieftain might dream of resistance, but the undeniable benefits of clean water, efficient trade, and safe travel made Roman rule increasingly difficult to oppose. The engineer, therefore, wielded a subtle political influence. His technical expertise solved the critical problems of everyday life, which in turn fostered the stability that kept the emperor in power. This reliance translated into significant political capital. A ruler would entrust these innovators with vast budgets and enormous workforces, giving them a level of responsibility few nobles ever enjoyed. Their success in preventing a siege or in feeding a metropolis could make them more valuable to a city's survival than its governor. They proved that true power is not always about commanding people, but about providing for them. The most brilliant innovation could secure a ruler's legacy more completely than any military victory. A ruler's glory could be erased by a single scornful verse. While architects built monuments and jurists wrote laws, another group wielded a far more fluid and pervasive form of power, the keepers of stories. In cultures built on oral tradition, the bard, the poet, and the griot were not mere entertainers. They were the living libraries of their people, the guardians of memory, and the ultimate arbiters of a leader's reputation. Their words could forge a legacy or consign a name to oblivion. Among the Celtic tribes of ancient Europe, the bard held a sacred and fearsome position. A chieftain's power rested not just on his strength in battle, but on his generosity and the loyalty of his followers. The bard was the amplifier of that reputation. With a beautifully composed praise poem delivered at a great feast, he could solidify a leader's legitimacy, attracting more warriors to his banner and ensuring his name would be sung for generations. But this power had a dark and potent flip side, the weapon of satire. A bard who felt slighted or who was paid by a rival could unleash a devastating verbal attack. This was not simple mockery, it was a magical and social curse, believed to bring physical blemishes, bad luck, and a catastrophic loss of honor. The fear of a bard's satire was so profound that chieftains would offer lavish gifts to ensure their favor, effectively making these poets untouchable critics whose influence was both immediate and supernatural. A similar, though even more formalized, role existed in the kingdoms of West Africa with the Griots. These were more than storytellers, they were historians, genealogists, advisors, and diplomats rolled into one. A Griot family would be attached to a royal court for generations, their memories containing the entire history of the dynasty, its alliances, its triumphs, and its secrets. When a king faced a difficult decision, he did not consult a scroll, he summoned his Griot. The Griot would not offer an opinion outright. Instead, he would recount a historical narrative, a story of what a previous ruler had done in a similar situation. This was advice wrapped in tradition, a way of guiding the present by invoking the wisdom of the past. The Griot's narrative essentially defined what constituted wise and legitimate rule, making him a crucial pillar of the governance structure. His ability to shape the story of the king directly influenced how that king was perceived by the people, and ultimately how he would be remembered. This control over narrative was a soft power of immense potency. A king could win a great victory, but if the bard's song focused on his cruelty or the Griot's tale highlighted his foolish risks, the triumph would be tarnished. Conversely, a mediocre ruler could be elevated to greatness through a skillful epic that emphasized his virtues and glossed over his failures. These storytellers understood a fundamental truth that every modern leader grapples with today, that perception is reality, and whoever controls the story controls the truth. They held the key to the most elusive prize of all, a legacy that would echo long after the throne had crumbled to dust. The most potent weapon in an emperor's arsenal was not a legion, but a ledger. Behind every throne sat a thinker, a strategist of coin and commerce whose ideas could fill a treasury or bankrupt a rival nation without a single sword being drawn. These were the economic theorists, the masterminds who understood that true power was not just conquered, it was calculated. Their treatises on taxation, trade, and resource management became the hidden blueprints for empire, guiding rulers on how to turn a kingdom into a wealth-generating machine. In the sprawling, river-fed civilizations of Mesopotamia, this role was a matter of survival. Scribes and advisors meticulously tracked the inflow of grain and the outflow of rations, using clay tablets to create the world's first budgets and economic forecast. They advised kings on the precise timing for storing surplus harvests, the logistics of distributing goods to workers building ziggurats, and the complex calculus of long-distance trade. Their counsel was not based on superstition, but on cold, hard data etched into mud. A ruler who ignored their advice on setting equitable barley prices risked famine and revolt, while one who heeded it could ensure the stability needed to launch military campaigns and construct monuments to his glory. This practical science of state economics reached its zenith in ancient India with a scholar named Kautilya. Living during a time of fracturing kingdoms, he composed the Arthashastra, a sprawling, unsentimental guide on how to acquire and maintain power. This was not a philosophical musing on ideal governance, it was a ruthless manual for real-world rule. Kautilya detailed everything from the spy networks needed to monitor the economy to the exact percentage of a harvest a king should collect as tax without sparking rebellion. He outlined strategies for creating state monopolies on key goods like minerals and salt, and advised on how to strategically bankrupt a rival kingdom through economic warfare before ever engaging its army. His work was a complete operating system for a prosperous state, built on the principle that a contented, economically secure population was the strongest foundation for a ruler's power. The Arthashastra's brilliance lay in its recognition that every subject was an economic actor. A farmer's productivity, a merchant's profit, and an artisan's craft were all vital components of national strength. Cortelia's advisor, the kingmaker behind the Mauryan Empire, did not just tell a ruler how to collect wealth, he taught him how to cultivate it across every level of society, turning the entire kingdom into a source of power. His ideas proved that the most effective way to control a population was not through fear alone, but through careful management of their prosperity. A king's most dangerous enemy was sometimes his closest ally. Foreign powers, from rival empires to neighboring kingdoms, perfected the art of brokering power from afar, manipulating the thrones of others without the burden of direct rule. They understood that influencing a ruler was often cheaper and far less risky than conquering his lands. This subtle imperialism relied on a simple trade, offering support in exchange for obedience, and it created a world of puppet kings and compliant courts. The Hellenistic world, carved from Alexander the Great's empire, became a chessboard for this kind of interference. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria were perpetual rivals, and their favorite strategy was to meddle in each other's internal affairs. They would identify a disgruntled Seleucid prince or a rebellious provincial governor, funneling Egyptian gold and weapons to support a coup or a rebellion. If their candidate won, Egypt would gain a friendly ruler on its border, a buffer state that was politically and economically beholden to them. The same game was played in reverse, with the Seleucids constantly stirring up trouble within the Ptolemaic realm. This turned succession crises into proxy wars, where the true king was often the one whose foreign backer had the deepest pockets and the most patience. The Romans elevated this practice into a science of empire with their system of client kings. Instead of expending vast resources to garrison every conquered territory, Rome would often leave a local ruler in place, but only after he had sworn absolute loyalty to the Roman Senate and people. These client kings appeared independent to their subjects, minting their own coins and managing domestic affairs, but their foreign policy, their military ambitions, and the succession of their own throne were all dictated by Rome. A client king like Herod the Great in Judea owed his power entirely to Roman support. He built magnificent cities and lavish ports to please his Roman patrons, and he ruled with brutal efficiency to keep his restive population in line, all to maintain the favor of the distant empire that had put him in power. His loyalty was not to his people, but to the source of his authority. This created a unique class of power broker, the local ruler who served two masters, his own people and a foreign empire. He had to walk a razor's edge, appearing strong and sovereign to his subjects while remaining utterly compliant to his foreign sponsors. He became the vital intermediary, the man who translated Roman demands into local action. For the empire, he was a perfect tool, a low-cost governor who could be praised as an ally when he succeeded and disavowed as a rogue agent if he failed. This was power brokering on an international scale, where the strings controlling a king could stretch for thousands of miles, all the way to the throne room of another sovereign. A royal succession was the ultimate moment of vulnerability for any dynasty. In that fragile interregnum, when the old king was dead and the new one not yet secure, the true architects of power stepped from the shadows. Their goal was not the crown itself, but the control of whoever wore it. These unseen hands understood that the most enduring influence was forged not by ruling, but by choosing the ruler. They turned the chaos of succession into an opportunity, backing their chosen candidate in exchange for future favors, political access, and a guarantee of their own survival. The stakes could not have been higher. A miscalculation meant not just a loss of status, but almost certain death. The Ottoman Empire perfected a particularly brutal form of this game. The law of fratricide, established to prevent civil war, meant a new sultan would often ascend the throne and immediately order the execution of all his brothers. This grim practice made the selection of the heir a matter of life and death for everyone in the royal household. Court factions, led by powerful viziers, the queen mother, or the chief eunuch, would tirelessly maneuver to back the prince they believed would win. They would whisper advice to the aging sultan, discredit rival princes, and even delay news of the ruler's death to give their candidate time to reach the capital first. The infamous cage, a luxurious prison within the Topkapi Palace where princes were kept isolated, became a hub for this covert campaigning. A janissary commander might send secret messages of support to one prince, while the harem treasurer funded another. The entire court became a betting ring, with every power broker staking their future on their ability to predict the next sultan. In medieval Europe, the game was just as cutthroat but played with different pieces. Here, the key players were often the high nobility and the church. A powerful duke with vast lands and a private army could throw his weight behind a claimant to the throne, effectively bankrolling their bid for power. In return, the duke would expect prime appointments for his sons, favorable tax status for his lands, and a dominant voice on the royal council. The church played a similarly decisive role. A papal blessing could transform a dubious claim into a divinely sanctioned right to rule. During the Norman conquest of England, Pope Alexander II gave his blessing to William the Conqueror, providing a crucial layer of moral legitimacy that helped secure his victory. For the Church, backing the right king meant influence over law, the expansion of Christendom, and the generous donation of lands and wealth. Success was the ultimate prize, granting the broker decades of unparalleled access. But failure was a swift and merciless trap. A noble family that backed the losing prince could find their titles revoked, their lands confiscated, and their lineage erased. The courtier who whispered too loudly for the wrong brother would simply vanish, another casualty of the endless, silent war for the throne. This relentless maneuvering proves that the most important crown was often not the one placed on a king's head, but the invisible one held by the person who decided he was worthy to wear it. History books are written by the victors but edited by their patrons. The chroniclers who recorded the deeds of kings were almost always employed by the very courts they described. Their job was not to provide an objective account, but to craft a legacy, a glorious narrative that justified the ruler's power and ensured his dynasty's place in the sun. In this carefully constructed story, there was little room for the shadowy advisor, the wealthy banker, or the cunning eunuch. To acknowledge their influence was to admit that the emperor might not be the sole architect of his own destiny, that his divine right or brilliant genius was perhaps assisted by a clever mortal standing just off stage. So these power brokers were quietly written out of the official record, their contributions minimized, attributed to the king, or erased entirely. Their absence from the mainstream narrative is not an accident of history. It is a deliberate act of political storytelling. Uncovering their true impact is a detective's work, piecing together clues from fragmentary evidence. Archaeologists might find a tomb of astonishing wealth for someone with no royal title, filled with grave goods that suggest immense status. A broken clay tablet might list a massive loan from a merchant's house to the crown. A letter between nobles might complain bitterly about the undue influence of a particular slave or freedman. We have to read between the lines of boastful inscriptions and read against the grain of royal propaganda. We must listen for the whispers in the margins of history. This erasure forces us to ask a profound question about how power works. Is true authority only what is visible, what is celebrated in stone and parchment? Or is it often the unseen hand, the quiet suggestion, the calculated loan, the interpreted omen that truly steers the course of events? Rediscovering these figures does more than just fill in the blanks. It completely rewires our understanding of the past. It reveals history not as a simple story of great men and their deeds, but as a complex web of relationships, dependencies, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. It shows us that power has always been a collaborative and often hidden enterprise. Giving these brokers their due does not diminish the rulers they served, it humanizes them. It reminds us that every throne, no matter how magnificent, was supported by a network of individuals whose stories are waiting patiently to be told.